everybody out there in YouTube land, and welcome to the Season 3 finale of Dungeons and Discussions. It's actually been kind of a quiet season. We never had any special guests, really, and I don't know. I kind of feel bad about that, but it's been rather a hectic summer for me.
Yeah, ain't it? So I think we're entitled to taking things a little easier.
Yeah, which is kind of like where we came from the rules, from the perspective of what we need to talk about today, which is the rules, and basically giving you ideas on how to bend them, how to break them, when to adjust them, and how to use them. But the first thing we should probably mention is that being able to break them, knowing when to break them and such, you should actually know what the rules are first, instead of just kind of like making them up as you heard them or as you think you know them. I'm not saying you need to play rules as written necessarily. I mean, you certainly can if you like, and some systems probably play better going rules as written. But for myself, I have always found that taking a pinch of rules as written and then, of course, modifying it to suit your table's needs works pretty good. It's a bit like cooking. I don't know what you think, Grim.
A little bit of spice, yeah. I think there's a number of different ways we can come at this, but yeah, you need to know the rules before you can break them, certainly. And a lot of RPGs are quite complex beasts, so if you change one thing in one part of the game, the knock-on effects, the sort of second and third order effects, can be unpredictable. Until you're quite experienced.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in a way, all RPGs are variations on rules, and that shapes the character of the game, the style of play for the people who play it, and so on. I know there's this big debate about rules as written going on at the moment. Apparently, I haven't seen much of it, but
I stay out of that stuff.
You literally couldn't do that with the first sort of couple of editions of D&D because it didn't have rules for much. So you were forced to rely on rulings, and everyone's table had its own set of rules. That's something that's gone away a little bit, I think, which is maybe unfortunate.
I tend to kind of space out when I'm reading rules, and so I lose rules a lot of the times. And when I actually get a game to the table, I end up kind of having to furiously flip back and forth to find a rule when it comes up in play. And that's unfortunate. I mean, but that's just kind of how my brain works. It's harder for me to absorb a rule in reading it than it is to actually discovering it during play, making it work, and then seeing how it works.
Yeah. And I think players only need to know the rules that apply to their characters, which is an advantage they have over games masters who have to know everything. Generally, it's better to make a ruling rather than to find the correct rule, because that can bring everything to a grinding halt. But sometimes if you make a ruling off the cuff, a player has designed their character with a particular interpretation of a rule in mind. And then if you change that, it can shit all over their character concept, which can be a bit of a problem.
Yeah. There were several instances like, and you've actually seen them on my channel, when I ran Scarlet Heroes, and a ruling had to come up that isn't covered in the book. And so I usually had to like make up a rule right there on the spot. And usually it kind of devolved into a rule from a game I'd seen before. For example, Scarlet Heroes does not use advantage disadvantage. But I remember using it a couple of times to figure out a quick bonus for something or a quick effect for something.
Yeah, it's kind of like legislation versus case law, isn't it?
A bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a really famous example of a set of rules that is very hard to get around being run rules as written is the 3rd edition D&D rules. And you know, I know I go back to that a lot, but that is because that is probably about the super crunchiest system I know of outside of the Iron Crown Enterprises rule sets.
Rollmaster.
Yeah, Rollmaster. But 3rd edition had some very, very peculiar rules that were specifically designed to make the game play like a tactical tabletop. In that area of effect, or actually say AoE, area of effect damages and opportunity attacks were a constant thing you had to worry about.
Yeah.
And originally, when we first played 3rd edition, we played it on a tabletop with maps and squares and everything else because it was easier to plot out movements and stuff during combat, which could get very complex. We've gotten to the point now where we don't need to. We've kind of got it all in our heads, so we can figure out. It's like, okay, this guy's going to provoke an AOO or whatever if he runs by you. But it does require the DM to kind of have a mental map of what's going on. And you can't, it's one of those rules that you just can't throw out. You can't just, tell everybody, okay, well, we're just not going to do AOO today because it's so integral to the way that the system is built. If you do that, you destroy half of what the fighters in that game can do. Because a lot of their stuff is based on AOO, and it also their movements and stuff is so integral to how they operate. Like the number of actions, can you take a 5-foot step before you cast, or can you take a full movement before you cast? Can you take a 5-foot step and do all your attacks? If you've taken more than a 5-foot step, you don't get all your attacks. Things like this, and it gets really complicated. It was, I don't know how we've managed to keep playing it for 23 years, but we continue to play it.
Habit, familiarity.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Integrating 1st edition Pathfinder really kind of breathed some new life into it. And the ability to customize your characters as much as you could also helped out a lot. But
yeah, that's the big thing with 3rd edition. I think the key rule about it is its customization, with the feats and the proper skills, and things like prestige classes and easy multi-classing. Character was king in 3rd edition. But I think you can play 3rd edition with Theatre of the Mind. 4th edition, it's a lot harder work.
Yeah, because it's even more tied to the map.
Yeah, because there's so many powers that are about either you moving more or the enemy being moved around and pushed into positions that are less advantageous. That sort of thing.
Yeah. And as hard as it is for me to say, there are some things about 4th edition that were actually pretty good. I'm starting to actually kind of appreciate the the minions and bosses aspect of the game.
Yeah. And
Because it's-
introducing a very minor death spiral in terms of bloodied.
Uh-huh. The whole bloodied thing being, that an enemy's attacks and abilities can change depending on how far down on hit points it goes. But the whole minions versus bosses thing, it's like my own play style tends to be a little bit more narrative and a lot less crunchy, because I'll be honest, I've played so many combats that combat can get slow, and it can bog down the game, and I don't want my combats to bog down the game. I think most opponents should last, 1 or 2 hits, and the party should be able to take on a lot of opponents. I know in reality, of course, like if you're faced with superior numbers, you're probably going to die. I mean, that's just the sheer number. I mean, it's just a sheer fact.
Yeah, unless it's the corridor scene from Old Boy, then maybe you have a chance.
Yeah, or the battle at Thermopylae.
Yeah,
but
basically the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. If you're using a tactical advantage for squeezing and stuff like that, but yeah, generally speaking, it's like, yeah, in a realistic situation, if you're faced with overwhelming numbers, you're probably not going to survive. But the characters are supposed to be heroes. The characters are supposed to be kind of special, in a way, in my opinion. And when I say special, I'm not talking about like, oh, these characters should never die. These characters should never be hurt. These characters should never be subjected to tribulations or problems and stuff. That's the heart of the game, is having things happen to characters. But, getting overwhelmed by a bunch of kobolds or something is not a particularly heroic way to die.
If you look at a lot of the source fiction, whether it's the Barsoom books or most heroic fantasy, the heroes are cleaving their way through dozens of mooks.
Yeah.
So I think D&D provides a great example of how changes to the rules can really affect the mode of gameplay. So if you look at BECMI or first edition, it really rewards caution and thinking and making sure you have as many tactical advantages as possible, but it was also still simple enough to be much more theater of the mind and hand wavy. If you move to third edition, it's still quite deadly, but you have all that much bigger level of character customization and so on, and so character development became a focus of the game. Fourth edition became a miniature skirmish game, with its emphasis on the battle map and selling you the various minis and the battle game that they did separately. And fifth edition, I don't wish fulfillment, I think, maybe, because characters are as powerful as they are in fourth edition, but it doesn't seem to be played in that kind of way. So I don't know.
Yeah. Fifth edition seems to be like some kind of hybrid of third and fourth. I don't necessarily. I would hesitate to say that it's taking the best of those, because it doesn't. But it takes some of its cues from each game. In that, yeah, the characters do seem to be a bit more powerful. It's interesting because they kept the feat system, which was introduced back in third, and I always thought was great. And yet, most people in fifth edition don't take feats; they take ability score increases.
Yeah, because it's usually the better choice, I think.
Yeah,
it's much more versatile. It gives you a bonus that you get quite often.
Yeah, there is that, but I mean, they capped the stats at 20. So
Yeah.
it's like, you know.
I mean, you could always house rule that you can't take pure stat advantages. You have to take feats, because a lot of feats are like one stat point and some other special effect.
Yeah. That's the one thing I noticed is, since most of the feats are one or plus one stat point anyway, it's like you might as well take a feat over a ability score increase. But hey, you do you, I guess.
So Kit was asking about mooks.
Yeah.
In that comment below.
Yep.
I first ran into the concept of mooks in Feng Shui. I mean, you could always throw low-level monsters or baddies at people, and that was kind of the same thing. But the kind of one-hit kill mooks came out of Feng Shui, which to me is like the king of genre emulation mechanics. And mooks was part of that, the stunt system being the other part.
Yeah. And literarily, it's a hard word to say. I think one of the earliest examples you can see of mook versus boss gameplay, or at least, reading wise, probably is once again Lord of the Rings, which, I maintain a lot of, or most of old D&D is pretty part and parcel based on Lord of the Rings, undeniably, and I'm sorry, but I'll fight anybody who says otherwise, because it's pretty clearly written into the DNA of the system. I mean, the very fact that you had, dwarves, hobbits, elves, and humans as your core 4 races, and of course those being the same 4 races represented in Lord of the Rings, probably because people were familiar with those from reading them in Lord of the Rings. Because at the time, that was the great fantasy novel, which is, don't take me out of context and say, oh, well, there weren't great fantasy novels written before Lord of the Rings, because, obviously, Howard existed before then, Lord Dunsany before then. So, there were lots of great fantasy before Lord of the Rings, but Lord of the Rings was the big one. I guess.
And all the old mythic epics as well.
Yeah. But Lord of the Rings, okay, specifically the Fellowship of the Ring, when they're attacked in the woods and the hobbits are kidnapped, Boromir is taking hits and hits and hits. He's taking multiple arrows, but they're killing orcs left, right, and center until they run into what is it, Lurge? The biggest orc.
I can't remember his name.
Yeah. Okay.
Who cares?
It's a giant. Yeah. It's a bigger, more powerful, orc captain type thing. So, which is then you could say like, okay, well, that's your boss monster, and the other ones are all like your mooks.
Yeah. Or the cave troll in the Mines of Moria.
Yeah, definitely. That was their boss monster in the Mines of Moria.
Yeah, not the Balrog. That was more of a story element.
Yeah, because they didn't really fight the Balrog.
No.
Yeah, and it was kind of defeated off camera, as it were.
Yeah. Gandalf's player had to go back to university after the summer. So.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know how else to describe that one. But yeah, I mean, most of your old fantasy novels and stuff like that, and your fantasy stories had your heroes, cleaving through mounds of faceless, mooks, or warriors or fighters who were insignificant to the plot. They weren't named characters. They weren't important to the story element. And then ending up fighting a big, more powerful, boss enemy, even if it was like the main villain of the story. And that's something I always liked. So it's kind of like, that's one of the things I liked about Scarlet Heroes. It also, well, which kind of comes from Godbound as well, in that you can have lots and lots of little, mounds of characters that you can just kind of like whale your way through. You can. Godbound literally has mobs that you can fight, and when I'm saying mobs get anywhere from like 12 to 20 hit dice worth of creatures that you're fighting.
Yeah.
So if you can imagine a single character who is able to destroy an entire mob, a 20 hit dice mob of creatures in a single round, they can do that. However, they also run into more powerful creatures which have to take their damage through the matrix, or they can deliver their damage what's considered to be straight, which is they don't matrix their damage. You take all their damage. And I'm really, really looking forward to running Godbound for you guys sometime. But I likes it. Kit also had a thing about you never feel bad about asking players about rules. You recently spoke to a novice GM who said they would never do that as it undermines them. As a result, they have paralysis about running games. Okay. I have felt intimidated by rule sets to the point where I didn't want to run the game because I was afraid of running it badly. Certainly, that's happened, especially with games where the rules were not written quite so well. Our dear friend Raven C.S. McCracken's first edition of Cinnabar was kind of like that. And I've told him to his face, I've said, like I loved the source material for your game, but the first edition system was so difficult to fathom with the rules kind of being all over the place that I couldn't even generate a character. Which is true. And that also kind of prevented me from running the game, because I'm kind of like, if I can't even figure out the rules to build the character, then how am I supposed to run this game?
Yeah, I think there's two extremes that can be intimidating. There's the mound of rules, like I don't know, Pathfinder perhaps, second edition even seemed overcomplicated to me than it needed to be, or Rollmasters, the classic one people go to, or Hero System. Those are really dense, heavily complicated rule for everything approaches. But the other way, completely vague, no real rules for anything much, save in the most general sense, that can be intimidating as well, because everything almost is going to come down to your interpretation and your ruling, and that can seem capricious and unfair to players.
Yeah, I kind of vacillate between the two myself, because it's, like Hero System, third edition was a rule for everything system, to the point where it even broke down magic item creation, which on the one hand I liked as a player, but I hated it as a GM, mainly because as a player, it was cool to actually be able to sit down and build a magic item if your GM would, give you the time and stuff to do it. The only problem is, because of the way the rules were set up, it usually took out of game time in order to do it. So, GM asks you, okay, what's your character doing? Well, I'm busy building this magic item. Well, you've been doing that for the past, 50 minutes. I know, because it takes a while to build a magic item.
Yeah.
And it also kind of took some of the magic out of the game, so to speak, because it's like, by codifying a set of rules by which the players could build magic items, it no longer made questing for magic items as important. And keep in mind, I'm one of those GMs who is kind of like, I despise the notion of the magic item shop. I think that's a travesty. If you have a place in your world where people can just walk into and buy magic items off the shelf, that to me is kind of like almost antithesis of, the whole reason why you go into dungeons and why you take up quests and all that.
I think sometimes magic is a stand-in for technology, and in those instances, I think you can.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I can understand if a character goes into, like, say, a used goods shop or something like that, and the seller just happens to have that one special magic sword or something behind his thing, and offers it up. That's kind of different. I mean, just because it's like, yeah, you're putting a monetary value on a magic item, but at the same time, it's like, it's a one-off. It's not like you have your shop just crammed to the gills, like, oh, look, here's a ring of protection right next to a scarab of protection right next to a Vorpal sword, and, I mean,
I enjoy filling up magic shops with like useless items or weird items and things that people aren't quite sure what they do, like a little blue thing that goes whoop on alternate Thursdays in between, or the atom heart of Shiva Goth.
Yeah. I don't know. The other part of that too is it always made magic item acquisition a little bit less special to me. So, it's like, what does it say about your character? Oh, I walked into the store and bought this +3 magic sword. Versus, I had to kill my way through this dungeon, and I found this +3 magic sword, and was being wielded by a skeleton warrior that nearly killed our party.
Yeah. So in a low magic setting, or something like Conan's Hyboreal or whatever, that's part of the rules about acquisition of magic items, that they're rare, they're hard to come by, and also part of the genre, which Kit and Victor have mentioned in chat.
Yes.
But if you're playing something like Eberron, then magic is technology and technology is magic, and so it makes sense to have magic shops and artificers on every street corner, that sort of thing, because that's part of that genre.
Kit says, usually avoid games with Far Eastern settings because the culture, tropes, and genre seem to be enormous, unapproachable, and vaguely intimidating. Yeah, they are. I am somebody who has a pretty strong working knowledge of Japanese culture, language, and to some extent the history and mythology. I've worked on it in books. I've been absorbed by it with martial arts. I am big on it in culture because of anime and video gaming. Just like I tell people, I'm a weeaboo from way before the time when that was actually a word. Because it's true. Because back in the 80s, you weren't a weeaboo necessarily.
No, you were a ninja wannabe.
Yeah. The closest word that we had back then was otaku, which I still consider myself an otaku to this day. Which some people say, oh, that's so cringy to call yourself an otaku. I tell those people, it's like, you know what? That's because you don't have enough peach fuzz on your nuts to call yourself an otaku, because you haven't been doing it as long as I have.
Kit makes a differentiation between genre and mechanics, but I think they're kind of the same thing, because in good games the mechanics help with projecting the genre. They fit the setting, so rules and setting are working in harmony there. And a genre is just a collection of tropes and kind of loose rules anyway. I don't think you should be avoidant of Far Eastern settings and things. I mean, think about your normal Western, right? The Western films, cowboy films, have tropes and ideas and so on in them. We can all think of them: Stetsons, but like a bowler hat was more common, or a derby hat was more common than the Stetson back then. The dueling with pistols at high noon hardly ever happened. All of these things, but the films are something different to the actual culture. So if you're running a Far Eastern setting or whatever, so long as you've seen some Hong Kong cinema, some wuxia films, whatever, that's what you're playing, not the actual culture, unless you've got someone who's going to be, butthurt at your table. Mm-hmm. Most people are there for the chop socky action, not the deep and respectful understanding of the history.
Yeah, most people who decide to play samurai and ninja characters, they're not necessarily doing it with the super duper deep understanding of how all that stuff works culturally or anything else. It's just kind of like, okay, it's a really cool character class, and I want to try my hand at playing it because I saw it in a movie or something. There was actually a pretty good example that I watched last night, actually, for that one. You familiar with the anime Bastard?
Yes.
Yeah. On Netflix, Bastard has gotten a new season, and in this season they introduced the samurai culture of that world. And these samurai don't look anything like like the actual historical samurai. I mean, these guys wear a lot less armor, for one thing. They don't ride horses. They don't use spears, which samurai mostly actually use a lot of spears and hafted weapons because they were mounted. They didn't even use archery, which samurai were also very proficient in. Instead, these guys all pretty much kind of had the tropey, everybody uses a katana, everybody has to yell out their special move, kind of, weeaboo weirdness. But it kind of worked because, you still managed to get that whole spirit of the samurai thing, because, that they had that whole thing about, like, oh, we can't do multiple attackers on one person. We have to be honorable and only do one person, single combats. So, it can work, even if you are running, like, let's say, samurai in a pseudo medieval European setting. You don't have to stick to hardcore, fish eating, calligraphy writing, death poem compositioning samurai.
Yeah.
That's a case of rules bending again.
Yeah, but again, it comes back to system reinforcing setting, right? So, say you wanted to run a John Woo style, guns blazing sort of game. You couldn't run that using BRP, for example, basic role playing, and have it work because the game is far too deadly for that. You couldn't have those running shootouts with, pane after pane of glass being smashed and people diving, firing two pistols and so on, because they would be so penalized they wouldn't stand a chance of hitting anything. So you would have to modify the rules for that. You'd have to have some way of ignoring shots until you run out of luck, basically that sort of thing. I think a lot of people try to replicate experiences they've had in other media without making any real adjustments to the rules that they're using, which is why we see so many bad 5e conversions of things.
Yeah. 5e is kind of like still everybody's whipping boy, because it's the current system and it's the current iteration, so that's what everybody going to be talking about. And even though D&D is trying to move past the whole edition wars thing, they're still creating edition wars by changing it. Yeah, everybody's inevitably.
Yeah, things aren't as bad as they were in the D20 days, but it is still somewhat disappointing.
Yeah. But like anybody else, I like to see what people will do with a rule set to change it. Victor Gorchev has made a really good set of modern gun gaming rules that work with fifth edition. And his guns are broken down really, really nicely. Not only does he have a wide variety of them, but he also gives bonuses and penalties and stuff based on, you know, how big they are and what accoutrements you put on them. You know, like if you put on a sniping scope, it'll, you know, increase the range that you can get a shot off, or give you bonuses to hit, things like that, which is kind of realistic. And that's kind of like a case of where you're talking about, you know, the technology replicates the magic item type thing.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not really that much of an OSR guy, weirdly enough, though I seem to have somehow got a reputation for being one. But I'm just about at my saturation point of OSR takes and games and things. But it is interesting to see how plastic that rule set can be if you strip it back and then build it up again, like a lot of people do. I just got a review package from Jim Raji, and you know, all of these adventures that he does, they're all pretty high concept, and so they all have their own spins and twists on the rules besides the spins and twists that already exist in Lamentations of the Flame Princess. And that just goes to show how plastic the rule set can be if you strip it back and start over.
Yeah, that is something you could probably say for a lot of the older editions of D&D, is the fact that because the rule sets were kind of nebulous and left a lot up to the GM interpretation, it also allowed GMs to kind of make up rules on the spot for whatever you needed to do, and it allowed you to customize, which is kind of like where there's kind of a disconnect, because okay, we know that, you know, Gary Gygax infamously was talking about how everybody should run the rules the same way at every table. That way it maintains a consistent game across all the different tables. And I don't know.
He did contradict himself, but
he contradicted himself pretty hard on that one. And that's one thing I can tell you didn't happen, because maybe it's not so common these days, but back in the day, and I say this a lot, but back in the day, you used to be able to like play a character in one person's campaign, and then, you know, somebody else would run during the week or next week or whatever like that, and you take that same character over to that other person's game, you know, and they'd say like, okay, well, I'm running this, and it's I need, you know, people need to get out their 5th level characters or whatever. And you know,
and you'd almost have a portfolio of characters that you took around.
Yeah, exactly. You had a portfolio of characters you take around, and they could have been in, like, you know, 50 other different people's games. And each one of those games, while they used the D&D rule set, they didn't all necessarily apply them the same way.
Yeah, I think that diversity of interpretation is the first big departure from the war games that kind of gave role-playing its genesis. Because in war games, you know, the situations and interactions are fairly limited, and so they can be somewhat comprehensively covered by the rules. And there's a very, very strong streak of simulationism in sort of pre-Games Workshop wargaming. And it was actually that wanting to expand that realism into social interactions and morale and things like that that really led to the advent of role-playing. If you watch Secrets of Blackmoor, which is well worth watching, you can see how role-playing emerges out of their drive to create much more complete and all-encompassing wargaming.
Mm-hmm. And I like the idea of the Braunstein type gaming where, everybody is got secret moves and stuff during the week and that sort of thing. But that requires a different level of interaction with your players and a different kind of set of communication. It's probably easier to do a Braunstein now than it was back then, just because you have mobile devices. So yeah, you could text a player during the week. It's like, hey, this happens to your character during the week, or what are you doing during this week?
Yeah, it's much more like how we used to run ongoing LARPs. So you'd have your meeting maybe once a month, or people would go to other meetings within the same milieu within the month. But then you would also have downtime actions, which would reveal rumors or expand your influence or something. And then the meetings were where you could wheel and deal and come to agreements with others, confront people, that sort of thing. So the Braunstein thing really reminded me of Salon LARPs.
Mm-hmm. Now the way I've been playing for the last, I don't remember how many years, hasn't been that way. It's been pretty much, it's like, when the session is over, everything just kind of like deadlocks, freezes, and goes into stasis until the next time you pick up the dice with that group and start playing again. Which I think is kind of the way that most people are used to playing it. I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah,
but,
yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
The big problem with rules that I keep having, you've probably heard me bitch about it on Tabletopless, but I've been playing games for so long that I get muddled between editions.
Mm-hmm.
And stumble where different editions do things differently to one another. Like Cyberpunk, there's been 3 main editions, or editions that we declare that it actually exist anyway.
Yeah,
and it does. Yeah, it does get me in a muddle sometimes.
Yeah. And to be fair, part of the problem with that is the diversion between 2020 and the way they did things to Red is pretty big. And I'm not sure why they chose to go that direction with Red, but
it's a lot more abstract. The rules with the hit points and the weapons being pretty interchangeable. I think they wanted to make it more accessible and have more aspects to it that would be more accessible to computer gamers or people coming from D&D, perhaps.
Yeah, that might be. It does create the whole damage sponge problem, which that's a different can of worms, or is it necessarily? Because, okay, there's a rule you can play with right there. If you're tired of the damage sponge opponents that can just sit there and soak up tons and tons of damage and the combats just draw out forever, herein is where you kind of employ your mooks idea again, where you shorten their hit points down. You could still make them whatever level or whatever you want, but decrease the hit points to where it's like it only takes a couple of hits to kill them. Unless, of course, you just really want a really long, drawn-out running gun battle.
Well, maybe here's where we can kind of segue into examples of rules changes that we've employed, that we've done. So in Cyberpunk Red, for Tabletopless, I have been leaving the main character's hit points as they're meant to be calculated. And I've halved every NPC's hit points because that feels more realistic to me for the enemies. And I've doubled the amount of damage that any vehicle can take, and I've given them an inherent armor bonus to make them last a bit longer, because vehicles are hella weak in Cyberpunk Red.
They're made out of paper.
Yeah. Have you had any rules modifications for any games that you've had particular success with?
Yes. Yes. And once again, I have to declare myself as a disciple of Crawford. Everybody take a drink. The best thing that he did, and I first encountered it in Godbound, was when he used his matrix system for calculating damage dealt to opponents and dealt to characters, which he carried on over to Scarlet Heroes. And it's something I pretty much I take every single game that I run now because it works and it's simple. And how it works is it's like, okay, on damage, 0 through 5 equals 1 hit dice of damage dealt to an opponent. On a 6 through 9, 2 hit dice of damage are dealt to an opponent. On a 10 or more damage, 4 hit dice of damage are dealt to an opponent. The main variations being in Godbound, that damage splashes into other creatures. So, like, let's say you're taking on like 8 orcs with 1 hit dice apiece. One swing of your weapon, if you manage to do 10 damage, calculates to 4 hit dice of splash damage. So basically, you've killed 4 orcs in 1 swing. And if that doesn't sound like mega heroic, I don't know what does. You can't do that in D&D as written, for certain.
No.
And you can't do it in too many systems as written. I mean, maybe you could do it in Exalted. I don't know. I don't really play Exalted. I haven't had a chance to mess with it. And at this point, I don't want to.
I haven't played with it since 2nd edition. I love the idea of Exalted, but it doesn't work with the rules that it has. It just gets completely bogged down.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of do something like the Mook or Mob rules. If I've got a lot of lowish level NPCs or monsters fighting a party, any damage that's done, I do it to the first creature, no matter which creature's being hit, and then carry it over to the second creature. So and just remove one from the board each time. So yeah, that has some advantages in that it's much easier bookkeeping, and it means that the characters who don't do very much damage still have a chance of taking out an opponent because someone else's hit may have reduced that goblin to like 2 hit points. And then you hit one with your quarterstaff for 2 hit points and you actually take it out rather than flailing uselessly constantly. Mm-hmm. So that's something I do.
And that used to be an old rule from back in the day. It was kind of like whoever gets the kill is the one who gets the XP.
Yeah. So that would often be a problem.
Yeah, because you'd have the fighter with his D12 sword, hit something and shave all the hit points down to like 1 or 2 hit points, and then mage with his little magic missile does 2 hit points to that thing from all the way in the back of the party lines and kills it and gets all the XP.
Yeah,
which that pissed everybody off, and it created a sense of competition inside the party that was a little unhealthy.
I did like the fray dice in Scarlet Heroes, especially for the magic user, where it feels like it really makes up for a lot because you can be quite creative and versatile with it.
I've debated having a fray dice for the current game I'm running with Other Dust. Just because it's like I kind of feel like it's a little too heroic, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know that it fits with that genre quite so much. Which takes us back to what rules suit a particular genre or feel or effect of a game that you're trying to create.
Mm-hmm. And the weapon damages in the Other Dust that I'm running are so high that you tend to kill most things in 1 or 2 hits pretty quick anyway.
Yeah. And one of the easiest fixes for making D&D more deadly is to reduce the number of hit points by a lot. but you have to remember to do it for the baddies as well.
Yeah. And one of the nice things about rule sets too is as you become more immersed in so many different rule sets, as you start to learn various games beyond one, and hopefully, you know, if you're listening to this, you don't just play one game, because if you just play one game and that's all you ever play, then you've kind of cheated yourself out of the experience of seeing how multiple systems have tackled this, how multiple ideas and designs, because there's not one game designer, because there's not one perfect game. If there was one perfect game, everybody would be playing that game and that game only. But as you become more immersed in a lot of different systems, you can kind of see how different authors have tackled some of these issues. Maybe you like hit locations. Okay, well, RuneQuest is a really good example of how to integrate hit locations into regular combat. It does add an extra step. It adds an extra complication, but if you like it, use it.
Yeah. Blue Planet's initiative system's quite good.
Mm-hmm.
You go in reverse order, so you start with the slowest person, but anyone with better initiative can choose to interrupt at any point and take their turn.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen initiative systems where it doesn't really matter what you roll, depending on the kind of weapon that you're using. Those get to go first. Like missile weapons always get to fire first, then weapons with longer reach than others get to go first.
Stunt systems quite easy to import, where you can give people advantages for doing outlandish heroic deeds. Like if you want to run a swashbuckling pirate adventure, then you want to reward players for acting like swashbuckling pirates and swinging from ropes and things. Mm-hmm. Most games, normally that would incur a penalty, but you could choose to give a bonus if they do acrobatic, piratey, buccaneery type things instead.
Mm-hmm. And some people would argue, that letting players do stuff like that, smacks of story gaming versus gaming. It's like, well, maybe so. I've always maintained that Torg is my favorite.
Yeah, I was just saying, it's genre emulation. It's a completely valid approach.
Yeah. Like I've said before many times, Torg is still my favorite game because it's simple. It requires a D20 to roll everything. It has a built-in system by which players can affect bad dice rolls, and it has a card-based system that encourages cooperative play, or even alteration of the narrative depending on when they play them. Which, I like it because it encourages players to stay active at all times, and it kind of stops the whole, like, oh, it's not my turn, so I'm not paying attention problem you have with combats. But it also applies to every aspect of that game, because you could be in mid-conversation with a bad guy who has the drop on you, even though it's not combat, and by playing the correct card, you could totally flip the circumstances of that encounter. But that's an effect of like genre emulation as it applies to the rule sets. You want to encourage these kind of things depending on the kind of game you want to get out of it. To go back to Kit's earlier example with running like an Asian style setting, if you wanted to make it feel a little bit more, ancient samurai type stuff, you could, your character who is playing like a samurai, if he steps out in front of the party before the party has a chance to do anything, and then he challenges, the enemy for the other side to one-on-one combat duel, wow, what a way to change the combat. Now, instead of the entire party getting involved and possibly getting killed, now you just have this one guy putting his life on the line. it does kind of mean that the rest of the party is going to have to kind of like sit back and watch, or break the oath or whatever, depending on what they decide to do. But still, it's a nice method of genre emulation.
Yeah. The other thing you can do is you can fiddle with the rules to help deal with problem players. If there's a particular behavior you want to encourage or discourage at the table, you can hand out bonus XP for good behavior and penalize for bad behavior, that sort of thing. And
yeah. Now, it should be noted though that you probably shouldn't penalize somebody for playing their character. And I'll give a really good example. In the Darwin's World game that I'm running on Sundays, good old Simon. Simon is running the doc, and that character just gives me the heebie-jeebies. I have never, as a game master, wanted to squash a character so bad, but I'm kind of like, I can't do that. I have to remain games master, and I need to be fair. I can't just have all the monsters just suddenly target that guy's character for no reason whatsoever.
I think the fun of the character is he's such a terrible, awful human being.
Yes, yeah, and that's the rest of the party. I figure I'll let the party sort it out as much as anything else, because I figure if the party gets tired of his crap, they'll deal with it. So. And they might. I mean, he may get to the point where, he becomes unbearable. That'd be interesting to see happen. But that's probably one thing you should do as a GM as well, is to remember that even though you have the power of the rules, you also have the power to use them and enforce them fairly to every player.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah. As my own home GM constantly used to remind me when I would get pissed, because we would play 3rd edition, and I would try to follow the modules or whatever like that and use their challenge ratings. Like, oh, okay, we have this party, so I can throw this challenge rating. And then, of course, they would just raffle stomp the monster in the first round. And piss me off, because I'm like, wow, that was supposed to be like a, a 1 hour encounter with, a deadly boss that, almost half kills the party, and you raffle stomped it in one, in 2 turns. But as he would remind me all the time, is like, you're a DM, you have an unlimited number of opponents. The party only has their one character each.
Yeah.
Which is also kind of like where I come to the idea that parties and players, PCs, I should say, are kind of are special animals. They break conventions of the world's normal settings. I keep saying but whereas the week before I was talking about how you can have parties that are composed of orcs and bugbears and tieflings and elves and dryads and dragons and monkeys and I don't know what else. My point on that was a party is the players interface with your game, and therefore it's a little bit beyond the rules, in that normally these groups of people probably wouldn't come together to do anything, but because of the circumstances of fate, fortune, or kismet, whatever you want to call it, these individuals came together, decided to hang together, and are looking out for each other mutually, for protection, for adventure, for romance, for whatever your character is going for in the game. So I like PCs to feel a little bit special. Not special in the you know, in the way that everything should go their way, which is what a lot of players seem to think the game is about. You know, it's you should still have a living world with things happening all around the characters that is going to go on whether they live or die. But at the same time,
yeah, we see a lot of nightmare GM stories, and not enough nightmare player stories. I think I've seen several people who are GMs talk about how, you know, joined to GM for a pickup group online, or they've taken a paid GMing gig, and they've been told, you know, your job here is to do what we want. You know, not to present a fantastic story or whatever else. It's to do what the players want, and we drive the game. That seems a total reversal of how things should be to me.
I agree. It's like, yes, I understand that the party is special, and I like them to feel special, but at the same time, I'm not here to make everything go your way. I'm not here to necessarily play into all aspects of your wish fulfillment fantasy.
Yeah.
Certainly, I will work with you to make those things happen if that's what you want. But it's going to take some work on your part to get there. You know, I'm not just going to give it to you. You know, if you want to be, you know, the, you know, King Dragon Slayer who, you know, has piled up a sits on a throne made out of dragon skulls and all this other stuff like that. It's like, that's certainly possible. And I will let you do this, but you're going to have to meet me halfway, which means you're going to have to gear up appropriately, take precautions, and hunt these things down intelligently.
Yeah.
You know, they're not mailing dragons to your character in giant crates with slots in them that say insert sword here for, you know, X amount of XP. You know?
I ordered a dragon, not a bad dragon.
Yeah. You know, and that's where players need to learn to use the rules. It's like, as a player, you know, you may not necessarily need the rules as much as a GM, but you should know at least the rules on how to play your character, on how your character's spells and abilities work, and when you should be able to use them. That's part of your process for how you become a good player. And without delving into rules lawyering so much, a player who is knowledgeable of the rules enough to be able to help a GM when a situation pops up that the GM is having to deal with is always helpful. Because it's like, you know, I'll be flipping through books trying to answer one person's question, and somebody else will pop up with a question, and you know, and if a player knows the answer to that and can really quickly tell them what it is, that takes a load off my plate. You know, and lets me focus on what I was working on originally. You know, but that's part of your responsibility of being a good player, just as much as it is the responsibility of a good GM to know his rules and to know when to break his rules. Now, should you as a player break the rules? Well, probably not, unless you're letting the GM know about it ahead of time. In which case, work with your GM, not against them. It's not an adversarial game so much.
Can I do blah 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 with this, even though it normally only does blah blah blah?
Yeah. And as a GM too, you should probably be open to what a player wants to do. You know, if the player says like, okay, you know, I want to become an intergalactic hitman, it's like the GM should probably say, okay, well, let's see how we can make this happen. Versus, no, you can't do that. Because it's important to know that, you know, as a good GM, your story should not necessarily trump what a player wants to do.
No.
Yeah.
You are not a storyteller. You are a story facilitator.
Yes.
Which has been my philosophy for a very long time, and I've started to see it pop up in other people's books, so that makes me happy.
Yeah. I understand that if a GM is running from a module, that the module is going to have some very strict interpretations on what you can do, or it may not be able to cover every situation, especially if it's like an early, TSR module. It doesn't have rules for what happens if your players wander into the village of Hamlet and suddenly decide to murder everybody and take over as the local lord or something, right? So that's an extreme example, but we always use extreme examples. But yeah, a GM has to be ready to deal with that if it happens. The DM can't just say, no, that's not what the module says. You can't do that.
Some people do that, though.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Because at that point, if you're doing stuff like that, then you're not playing for the PCs. You're just playing the story.
Yeah, I think there is some responsibility on the part of the players to play along. Play into what the games master wants. If you have a great big neon arrow pointing at the village saying plot here, don't take the other fork on the road. That's being a dick.
Yeah. And I've seen players do that too. They just resist all of your efforts to try to get something to happen, or they ignore it, and it's annoying, but it is also one of the reasons why I moved to sandbox gaming versus, module gaming.
Yeah.
Because it's easier. It's like, okay, the players are not always going to take the bait in a sandbox. It's like, okay, just because you have an interestingly shaped ruin sticking out of the ground, a couple of miles off course from where you're headed, it doesn't necessarily mean that the players are going to want to go over there and check it out. They're going to like, that's cool, and just ride on by. And you never get to use that, and that's fine. It's okay, sure, I spent all night building up an area for that, and they didn't mess with it. Okay, well, maybe you'll get a chance to use it again later.
Yeah, put it in the folder, save it for when someone goes off the beaten track from something else that you had planned.
Yeah. And I'm also famous for taking chunks of modules and just dropping them into the game somewhere where they don't necessarily belong. I used bits and pieces from the ruin at the end of the world in the last few Darwin's World game, just to kind of enhance whatever the players were working with. It's like these are, as far as the module goes, they're programmed encounters, but as far as I'm using them, it's just kind of like, they're just drop-ins.
Yeah, there's nothing to stop you like unrooting a particular encounter or location or dungeon from one place and putting it back in the player's path when they go a different direction, or letting them divert for a few sessions before gently nudging them back towards the actual plot. There's ways to deal with it.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, I guess on both parts, both the players and the GM's things is you kind of need to avoid the tyranny of the rules. And this also gets into rules lawyers. And I deal with one famously at my table every single week. Sometimes he's helpful.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, it feels like he's either quoting a rule for his benefit or to stomp what another party member is trying to do.
Yeah, you just have to assert your authority.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a player and you misstepped or something like that, and somebody gently reminds you, it's like, yeah, but you can't do that. Yeah. That's one thing.
Yeah, technically correct, but I'm making a ruling here in this instance otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Or they're more guidelines than your actual rules.
Yeah. I had a player who I ran an encounter, and I knew that the players would raffle stomp this thing if they managed to get all their attacks off in the first round. So I made sure that this creature went first, and it charged at the party and got all of its attacks off. Well, that player's like, you can't do that, right? What do you mean I can't do that? Well, he moved more than 10 feet, so he can't get all of his attacks per round. And he's right technically, but then as a GM, I said, well, he's got a feat that lets him do that. And we went on because it was kind of like, you can't say no.
What feat's that? I don't remember that from the books. It's called fuck you. That's why.
Yeah. It's one I just made up.
Yes.
I'm the GM. I can do that. And I'm not doing that to be a dick. I'm just doing that because it's kind of like I know what the party's capabilities are. I know what will happen, and I know that this encounter will not be, will be meaningless if this thing doesn't get its special attacks and all this stuff off to be able to progress whatever it is I'm working on. And there's cases where that happens, and that's a case of the GM breaking the rules, but. In a good way. Yeah, in a good way. You're breaking the rules in service of the game, not to be a dick or to screw the party over.
In a limited and specific way, as our government said.
Yes, and that's perfectly cromulent.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, can you think of anything else that we can cover as far as the rules there? Or?
I mean, there's some examples of where the same rule set, mostly the same rule set, has been used for different genres, and you can examine that and see how it's been tweaked. And I'm not necessarily talking about, openly generic systems like GURPS. I think Modiphius's 2d20 system had a bit of a rough start, but more recently, I think they are managing to customize the system to its various different games quite well, while keeping the core system the same. So I think that's a good example that you can look at of how a system can be modified from setting to setting, from game to game.
Mm-hmm. There are other settings with rule sets that are you could play with to kind of do what you wanted to do, like Call of Cthulhu. Okay, most of the creatures in Call of Cthulhu are Lovecraftian in nature, and even though they have specific rules for every creature, of course, they encourage your games master to create their own creatures with their own abilities, and they don't put parameters on those things. It's up to you to do that. And certainly you can make them as mind-bendingly awful as you want, because the players are kind of playing the game with that as in mind, Yeah.
I think the OSR is another good place to look, because people have done all kinds of weird things with it. And to the point where there are some games that, well, are they OSR? Are they compatible or aren't they? It becomes an interesting question, but there's all sorts of stuff that's been done there.
Yeah. And I famously love stuff like that. I love to see what people will do with the rule set and how they can change it up and make it kind of familiar and yet different. And that's probably why I like Crawford stuff so much. It's just because 9 times out of 10, if I have a rules problem that I've encountered in the past, I can look at that's something Crawford has done and go like, oh, that was a great idea. I don't know why I didn't think of that. Or I can just kind of see the genius in how it works. Because like one of his best examples is Worlds Without Number, which it only has 3 classes. 4 if you decide that you want to play a hybrid class, which is, basically a mix of one of the other two. But from those 3 classes / 4 classes, you can literally emulate any other class in any other system that you want, and you can kind of customize and tailor it the way you want to within the first couple of levels. Then it just depends on how it's set up. Some of the other things that he's done that made sense to me were he built his own spells. He didn't rely on pre-existing spells. He says, yeah, sure, you can drop those into your game if you want to from whatever OSR products you want, but here's some ones that I already have built, and they work great. They're not overpowered. They're they keep game balance pretty well in hand, and they work. And that's what I like about it. His stuff is balanced to the point where everybody is kind of important in their own way. Versus a couple of other systems where it really seems like one class dominates another, and then you as a GM are having to account for that. Notably, mages. Because honestly, mages in most systems tend to break the game. And you can see where various games have kind of worked around it, especially as they realized where mages were breaking the game. Radji, James Edward Radji IV, who came up with Lamentations of the Flame Princess, set down in his own rule set which spells you could use. And it's a limited spell list, but he also, I believe in his rules, said that you shouldn't have a spell that can duplicate what people can do, kind of thing, or as a replacement for it. In other words, okay, if there's a locked door and somebody has a specialist class that can try to pick the lock, you should not have a spell that can open that door. And the genius in that is it's kind of like everybody keeps their niche protection. And his mages don't have lots of really super duper destructive spells. They do have magic missile, and the way he does his magic missile is really, really cool, because it pretty much it's the best spell the second best spell in the game, because it's a spell that it doesn't matter what level you are, you'll keep using it.
Yeah. And you can customize it to be your sort of signature spell.
The other one being another first level spell, which is summon.
Yeah, never a good idea.
Yeah, it has simultaneously made and broken the game on many occasions. But that's what's so much fun about it. When the mage is pulling out the summon spell, it's kind of like, oh dear, how is this going to bite us in the ass?
Yeah, spell of last resort.
Yeah. But that's another great set for rules. Or how people have modified them to be useful to them. I do understand that in future editions, he's actually going to be dropping all the demi-humans out, which kind of bums me out a little bit. But
he never wanted them to be in there in the first place. It was just, he felt that people wanted them, so he'd better.
Yeah, and I do know people who absolutely won't play a game if human is the only option.
Yeah, so. Well, those people suck. Maybe he'll add some additional classes or something suitable. The elf is a combination fighter magic user. Maybe you could find something that replicates that.
Yeah.
I don't know why you need halflings when you've got rogues, really, or specialists.
Yeah.
And dwarves, maybe you could have a crafter class or something.
Yeah, but they tend to have beefier hit points than everybody else.
Yeah.
So it's a beefy crafter. I'm a crafter who can whoop your ass.
Yeah.
You have anything else, or
No, I was just going to say, Magic's one of the probably
Yeah.
the most heavily modified and house ruled area in any game, really, because every single
Yes.
spell is an exception. So.
Yeah, and I have seen various different systems for how to deal with it. I haven't yet come across one that I think is just the best. I don't like the Vancian system.
I mean, neither.
Not because it's stupid or anything. It's just I don't. The whole idea that you memorize a spell and you forget about it is okay. I get it, but at the same time, I feel like spell casting should be more flexible. To wit,
Yeah.
I prefer the sorcerer approach to the magic user approach, wherein like once you learn a spell, you always know that spell, but you can only throw it so many times, or you can throw it a lot of times per day.
Yeah. I think there are alternative magic points rules in the GM's guide, I think.
Yeah. And originally we used to use a mana point system, and I used to like it because it really made you kind of think about which spells you were going to cast. Of course, we also had a fumble table, which could do horrible things to you, like suck all your mana dry.
Yeah. But these again are sort of genre choices.
Yeah, and again, it's another case of modifying the rules to fit your tastes. Okay, you don't like the magic system in X game. Okay, well, find a better way to use it and look at other examples, see what other people have done with it. You might find something that you like better and that you can translate. I personally, one thing I have always liked is we have incorporated rolling a dice for spell failure every time you cast a spell, because it eliminates that whole every time I shoot a spell off, it is perfect and it always works and it never fails and there is no problems. Whereas everybody else has that whole, well, if I swing my sword, I have a chance of fumbling or critical hitting. So, now your magic has a chance of going awry.
That can feel like a bit of a jip with spells, though. Because a fighter can swing away with his sword all day long, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you cast a spell and it misses, in a lot of games, you can't you cast that spell again. So it's kind of, it didn't do anything.
Yeah. I mean, but again, you could always rehouse rule that to say, like, okay, well, if you failed to cast your spell, it's like, okay, well, you didn't expend a use of that spell.
Yeah.
Or just say that, you only expend a use of the spell when you successfully cast it and not otherwise. That would be mine. And look at that right there. I just made a rule. But that's how easy it is. That's what problem solving for rules really is. It's when you find a problem in play, you just really quickly house rule it and keep moving. And keep the game going. It's important not to get bogged down on rules. Don't let the rules rule your game, I guess is the best way to put it. You rule your game the way you want. And if you find that running rules as written is the best way to run your game, then do it that way. If your players like it, you like it, and everything, that's fine. But don't be, I would say 9 times out of 10, you're probably going to encounter a situation where a rule as written isn't going to cover something that happens in your game. In which case, don't be afraid to make a judgment call. That's kind of why you're the GM. That's what the players are looking to you for, is to make those calls. If it's something outside the scope of the rules or it's something you want to get done quickly, Don't be paralyzed by the rules. Even if you know, and even if you don't know the rule, don't be afraid to come up with something quickly in order to solve the problem. You know, because hindsight is 2020. You can always look back later on and research and go, oh, this is what I should have done. You know, and then you can go back the next time you play and say, hey guys, okay, I remember last time when I said this and this for that. Yeah. Well, it turns out it is covered by a rule here. So for the future, we're going to do it this way. So just consider that last time when I made that ruling a one-off, you know, and just keep moving. Don't get bogged down on this stuff. It's not, it's not rocket science. You know, your world is not going to come to an end because you missed a rule. or maybe it will. I don't know. You know, what happens when you, when you throw that bag of holding into the sphere of annihilation, but you opened it up halfway? I don't know. You want to say, oh no, it causes a black hole dimensional vortex and sucks your entire world into it and spits it back out through a white hole. I guess you could do that, but why would you do that?
The suction beast in the Yellow Submarine.
I don't remember that. But you know, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to play with stuff. You know, something I think has been kind of nerfed from first edition D&D to current edition D&D is artifacts.
Because the one-off magic items.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like, okay, artifacts used to be a source of wonder that people would really, you know, look forward to finding, but not necessarily, because artifacts usually had a downside that was pretty horrible, or they had knock-on effects that were maybe not to be desired, and some of them could be pretty severe. You know, Hand of Vecna, Eye of Vecna type stuff, right? To use more modern people's understanding of a game. Looking at Hand of Vecna, Eye of Vecna in 5th edition versus 1st edition, it's kind of a big jump. And I think a lot of the artifacts got kind of demystified somewhere between 1st and 5th. There's no, you know, Vorpal swords were never considered artifact class, but they were of such a high magical caliber that they were something to be sought after, you know. Holy Avengers, even more so, because they were so rare. But crazy stuff like, you know, the dragon orbs, you know, you have the power to control dragons. And if you get like the scepter and the crown and all that stuff like that, you could really control dragons. I believe that's how that worked, right?
I think so.
Yeah. Did they even mention those things in the new books? I don't even know if they're in them.
Don't think so.
Hey, Mr. Blobby.
Speaking of not getting bogged down, I need to rest up before I have to make dinner. So.
Oh, all right then. Well, then let's bring it to a close. We've gone an hour and a half, so. But yeah, sorry if it sounds like we were rambling a lot on this one, because rules is a really big thing, and it's so different. It's such a big topic. It's hard to cover all of it, really, because, well, the fact is that rules change from game to game, and the problems with rules will change from game to game. But the bottom line should be make rulings as you need to. Don't be afraid of rules, and don't let rules rule your game, I guess. Should be the way to say it. Right?
Yep, sounds good to me.
Yep. All right. Well, this was the end of another wonderful season of Dungeons and Discussions. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. If you're catching us on the replay, you know, I hope you found something this season that helps or enhances your game, or at the very least, it gave you a chuckle. I really look forward to being able to do these in the summer, and hopefully there will be a season 4. And maybe we'll be a little bit better prepared for season 4 with all the special guests and
so forth.
Yes. because I really feel like we got kind of caught with our pants down this season, so to speak.
Yeah, we might be back for an occasional one-off when you have some time, but we shall see.
Yes, definitely. We'll definitely have some one-offs here and there. And there are guests whose availability will determine when I can do the one-offs. But for now, yeah, this is farewell for another season, and we'll catch you on the next season. And so until then, y'all take care. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Look, a Dungeons and Dragons ride!